Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's talk, Indians and Energy Transition, Green New Deal to Drill Baby Drill with Dr. Andrew Curley. I'm Maggie Onosorgan, the Public Programs Manager here at the Amerind, and as always, before we begin our program, we would like to acknowledge that the Amerind is located in southern Arizona on lands where the Otham, Hopi, Zuni, Yoemi, and Apache families have lived for untold generations. Their wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are very grateful for what all of these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. We would also like to thank our members and donors who make these free programs possible and help fulfill Amerind's mission to foster and promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist the Amerind in supporting its missions by becoming a member or donor, please visit our website, amerind.org. Our next online talk will be next Saturday, August 2nd at 11 with artist Ishkoten Dugai. He is a painter and sculptor, and he will be talking about his work and influences. Our next scholarly talk will be Saturday, August 23rd with Dr. Gary Feynman from the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. He will be speaking on human governing and well-being and his ongoing research of how we can learn from our ancestors to make a better world for tomorrow. We hope you will join us. Starting in September, our online talks will be changing days and will be held on Thursdays from noon to 1, rather than on Saturdays, which hopefully will allow more people to tune in on their lunch breaks. And of course, as always, when our speakers allow, the recordings will be sent to the registrants and be posted on our YouTube channel, Amerind Foundation. For anyone in the area, we have a number of summer events happening. So as always, please check out our website for all those details. The recording of today's program, as I said, will be sent to all our registrants to watch later this evening on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions today for Dr. Curley, please type them in the Q&A chat box and we'll get to as many of those as possible after his talk. We're very excited to have Dr. Curley with us today, speaking on this important topic and his new research focused on the perspectives of energy transition and its effects on Indigenous communities. Andrew Curley is an associate professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. He is the author of Carbon Sovereignty, Coal Development, and Energy Transition in the Navajo Nation, published by the U of A Press. So please welcome Dr. Andrew Curley.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you to the Amerind Foundation for providing me a forum to share some of my latest research, and thanks to the participants over Zoom who are carving out some time on a Saturday to listen to this research. So this is a talk that's based on ongoing and prior research. So it's a combination of different research projects that I'm going to try to summarize over the course of the presentation. I'm Diné, a member of the Navajo Nation, so coming up from northern Arizona and around that part of the Colorado Plateau. I'll be speaking a lot about energy questions relating to the Navajo Nation primarily, but I'm also going to be talking about some research that we've done so far among the Southern Ute, which are neighbors just to the north of us. And I'm also doing ongoing field work with Jicarilla Apache Nation in New Mexico, and they're all part of the same, they tap into the same energy sources, but I'm not going to be sharing so much of that research today because of time. So Indians and Energy Transition, this is a contemporary project. It might be different from some of the other presentations you've seen here in the past, which might be more attuned to archaeological questions, to things about culture and longstanding histories of Indigenous peoples in the region. And my work builds on that scholarship, and it is informed by that scholarship, but I'm looking at a contemporary question, and you can recognize that it's a contemporary question because you might hear some of the political rhetoric in the subtitle, from Green New Deal to drill, baby, drill. And these are expressions within our political discourse in the United States that are advocating for a certain kind of approach to energy. And you all probably have been aware of that and understand some of the larger energy questions that the United States is thinking through, that different regions are thinking through. And what I intend to do in this presentation is to think about how the oscillation between an approach on renewables to extractive industries as a priority of different parts of the federal government and as a part of energy development, or in some language, energy security, how these might impact tribes, how tribes are interacting with these changes. And so that's basically the question that I will be trying to answer over the course of this presentation. So that explains the subtitle. Now, this picture, it was a last minute addition. I had a different picture on the slide prior to moments prior to the beginning of this talk, but I like it because it's a double exposure, and it's an accidental double exposure. It's one that I took recently, actually during the course of this field work, where I was trying to take pictures of the landscape, and the camera battery. This is a film camera, and the camera battery died in the middle of the second exposure, and that kind of messed things up for me, and it didn't advance the film, and as a result, I got an accidental double exposure. But it's really interesting when I started looking at it, because this is if you can make out, this is the Navajo community of Sheep Springs, where there's a gas station, a Dino Care, right along the road. This is going up north toward between Gallup and Shiprock, and in an area that has been impacted by every form of development for the tribe, especially around energy extraction, such as coal, uranium, and then also oil and gas. And so those are this is an area that's heavily impacted by these industries, and is in the kind of in the center of some of these energy transition conversations. And it just seemed like it too much on the nose for me to not have this transition picture, i.e. a double exposure on top of this question of energy transition. So anyway, that explains the image, and now you know where you're at. You got the clouds. I don't need to explain the symbolism that I'm trying to accidentally show through the picture. So let's go back in time. I decided to tell this story more chronologically than thematically, like I've done in the past. And then maybe this will help you as the listener to kind of understand how the Navajo Nation in particular has been thinking about these questions, but some of the other tribes that I've been talking about. So this is a picture taken outside of the Navajo Nation Council chambers in 2009. Which is in Window Rock, Arizona, very northern part of the state, right on the edge of the Arizona-New Mexico border. And I didn't take this picture because I am in the background. Okay, you can't see me, and I can't move the cursor around, but I'm in the distance, wearing a hat, looking aloof, like I'm confused. So it's really hard to make out, but I'm in this particular march, which was a demonstration of support among tribal members. So all of us are Navajo members in this picture, going to the council to try to persuade the council to pass a couple of legislations related to energy development. And the legislations were called the Green Jobs Act. These were two legislations. One created a fund, the other created a board that would oversee the money, that was trying to attract federal spending on green jobs, as was broadly defined in the legislation. And this was an attempt to mitigate some of the problems of job loss and legacies of environmental extraction on the Navajo Nation, and in particular, the effects of strip coal mining that had been happening on the Black Mesa side of the reservation for the previous 40 years at this point. And so a few NGOs, non-governmental organizations that are linked with environmental groups came together to draft the legislation, to get sponsorship within the Navajo Nation Council, and to also mobilize the support with the green job shirts and all of that. And eventually that legislation passed and is still actually active legislation in the Navajo Nation. Now, on the broader landscape of political things happening in 2009, you might remember that we also just were in the throes of what has become known as a Great Recession, when a lot of value in home mortgage, and I can't even explain the whole complicated world that the financial issues that were um, happening at the time, but a lot of devaluation in companies, and then of course, a recession because of lack of confidence in the economy, all of that kind of spiraling out of control, which demanded at that time federal investment. The federal government had to come in and try to stop the downward spiral of the U.S. economy. And part of the thinking at the time, especially among environmental groups, was this is an opportunity to start to really invest in infrastructure for green renewable energy technologies, or sustainable energy technologies. And so green is the color, the association that's been used to describe these sustainable energy technologies. Whether or not they're green, that's a whole nother question, and there's a lot of debate about that, especially in more recent years. But that's how these things were being thought about at the time. And so this particular legislation at the local level, at the tribal level, dealing with the tribal government, was trying to respond to these larger national questions that were happening and attract monies that were anticipated. I'm sorry, I'm talking in passive voice, but that's the only way I can think about this at this time. That were anticipated to come from the U.S. Congress in the America Recovery and Reinvestment Act that Obama and Congress eventually pushed and signed. And I don't know if you all remember that, but that was one of the initial big congressional acts to get the U.S. to invest in renewable energy technology. And so there's a whole lot of there was people that were working in DC, communicating with people at the tribal level, saying, "Hey, this is what we anticipate this legislation to look like. Here's what you would need on the ground in order to receive those monies." In the end, none of this really panned out. The green jobs passed. It did it overcame all of the tribal requirements legally. There's a board, there's a fund set aside, but the activities of that organization never panned out. And I wrote a whole paper theorizing why I think this happened. And my main takeaway is it was working out of sync with the way tribal governments naturally work with energy and extraction. And there's a whole decades long history about how tribal governments are set up to deal with energy questions. And this Green Jobs Act was not consistent with that way of thinking. And so as a result, we never really got an investment in renewable or other kinds of energy technologies in our nation through this particular legislation. But that goes all the way back to 2009. Similarly, around the same time in 2013, and this is really the crux of my dissertation research, which eventually became the aforementioned book, Carbon Sovereignty. The Navajo Nation was reconsidering a 50-year lease with Salt River Project. Now, if you're all from Arizona, you might know Salt River Project is one of the most important utilities in the state, and it's the utility that has a majority monopoly around the Phoenix metro area, serving the biggest city in the state. It's a public utility, and it's one that has had a long history working with the Navajo Nation, primarily around the power plant, the Navajo Generating Station, which is located or was located outside of Page, Arizona. And so the Navajo Nation was confronted with this lease to renew it for another 25 years in order to extend that power plant and a coal mine site, the Kayenta mine site, until 2044. So there was a lot of conversation at this time within the Navajo Nation as to whether or not we wanted to continue in fossil fuel and extractive industries. This mural expresses some of that environmental thinking coming from the environmental groups that were opposed to the renewal of the lease and were trying to envision a different kind of sustainable or alternative energy world. And what I really like about this mural was painted in 2013 while we were thinking about this lease. Sorry, and this is in downtown Phoenix. You can still, it's near the ASU downtown campus. You can go and visit it today if you want, if you want to drive up there, or if you happen to be in Phoenix at the time. This whole downtown area has seen a big transformation in those more than 10 years, but that mural is still there. What I like about this mural is it highlights the spatial unevenness between the Navajo Nation and Phoenix. So it's a critique. There's a critique embedded in the mural about the wastefulness of energy and other kinds of resources that are dedicated towards Phoenix and its expansion, and that's represented on the left-hand side of the panel. Where the right-hand side, sorry, I didn't include it in this picture, but it emphasizes alternative and sustainable energy technologies. And what I think is interesting about this mural is taking Navajo, and in this case, Danatam cosmology, the first man basket with Mother Earth and Changing Woman represented in the center, where they are blessing these kinds of alternative and sustainable energy technologies on the right. So it's an idea, it's an idealization of a particular kind of energy and development response to legacies of extraction. And this was part of the conversation going back to 2013. In the end, though, despite this type of mural and despite the support for these alternative and sustainable energy technologies, the Navajo Nation agreed to renew the lease between SRP and the tribe for another 25 years. And what happened was that SRP decided after a couple years after the ink had dried and we had signed the lease that they were going to renege on that, remove themselves from that lease agreement, close the power plant, demolish it, and end that particular energy project on the Navajo Nation, despite the fact that the tribe itself wanted to continue it for another 25 years. So what this whole situation reveals is that despite our intentions, whether or not we want alternative energy or we want to continue into coal, a lot of these decisions are outside of our hands, right? It depends on what the utility is thinking at that particular time, and the utility is responding to the availability of resources primarily, not so much the political rhetoric that we hear in Washington. This is what I've seen, despite, for example, the fact that Trump in his first term embraced coal, this power plant and coal mine shut down during his first term. So there was nothing in the rhetoric that continued it. It was the utility deciding that in the long term, coal was going to be more expensive than other kinds of energy sources that it could procure. And so that was the main rationale. It wasn't tribal sovereignty. It wasn't an investment in alternative or sustainable energy technologies. It wasn't even political rhetoric coming from DC. It was the cost of energy production for relative to the energy sources that it was receiving. I.e., in other words, natural gas was cheaper than coal was, and so that really prompted that to close down. So this has been part of the challenge that the tribes have been facing. Now, to give you a better understanding of this landscape, we'll go from this grounded map and some of the questions and dilemmas that I'm trying to explain here, and give you just kind of a really abstracted global viewpoint of what's going on. And these are maps that I generated a couple years ago, and I'm sure you can still generate them now through the Energy Information Agency, that overlay federally recognized reservation lands. So these are not our traditional homelands, which are much more expansive, but the limited lands that we have left after years of colonization. These are reservation lands alongside known energy sources, subterranean primarily. So here we have oil and gas and the basins, the boundaries, the definitions of where these resources might be found. Then you can see in the western states, especially in the Mountain West, there's a lot of overlap between tribal spaces and known energy reserves. And so that's what's creating these dilemmas between tribal development and wanting to continue with fossil fuel, and also defining that as a form of tribal sovereignty and agency and development, right? Like these are things that we're going to use these resources as a way to find an industry that we can then do other things, accomplish other kinds of governing goals with. And so the fact that there's a spatial overlap between tribal reservation spaces and known energy resources creates these dynamics within tribal governments. And it might not be as pronounced in other reservations where there's less of those overlaps. You see, there's a lot of pressure, uh, social and political pressure to develop these resources within tribal lands when your reservations are directly above them. And then where I will be talking about later in the presentation, I'm sorry, I'm pointing and you can't see what I'm pointing at, but if you can identify where the state of Arizona is, where Tucson is, and go straight up to the Navajo Nation, and then over into the north central part of that, this is where the oil and gas areas are found that I'll be talking about. And then this is coal, a similar map. Unfortunately, they use gray, so you can't really distinguish gray and purple for the color scheme that they're using. But I think you get the idea that it's a similar kind of tension that's between tribes and where there are no coal reserves. And this was something, that was generating a lot of the pressure to develop coal, and the pressure and the idea that it was an opportunity for tribes over the past 40, 50 years. So to give you a sense of the political context, how do these industries develop on these reservations with the tribal governments that you hear about? So there's a couple of things at work. There's federal policy, federal Indian policy, and if you go into Native American studies, you really learn this, which is a really good stepping stone for understanding federal Indian law. I think really there's very few disciplines, and so this is a plug for actually area studies, which is under a lot of assault in the university, including my own University of Arizona. Like, where else are you going to be able to focus on the history of these policies other than in Native American studies that really just hone in and force you to read in detail the legislations and particular histories. Otherwise, in other disciplines like my own in geography, we just gloss over it, but we don't go into the necessary detail. So I think it's really important to value these area studies if you really want to get to know a place in depth. And so anyway, going into the federal Indian policy, on the right-hand side in the right-hand column, you have, and this is in chronological order, a series of congressional acts that define the way tribal sovereignty looks today. Going back to 1887, when there was an attempt at assimilation and removing Indians from the land, and in this case, moving land from the Indians, there was an idea of just dividing the reservation land by population and then selling the quote unquote surplus as a form of money, gaining money. And this was kind of a policy of land that existed for the federal government at the time. With state, there's a lot. The West was seen as having a lot of land. They did similar kinds of tactics with the land grant system for universities, and that's part of the whole critique of the universities is some of those lands were also Indian lands. And this particular legislation was trying to create individuals out of this collective identity of Indians, so or of the tribes themselves, like Diné or Navajo people. So, you have these mix of individual leases on individualized allotments within a larger reservation, and it created all sorts of problems, more problems than benefits, and a lot of inequality from the sudden amount of monies coming in from this new industry that, especially with oil, that was developing around, in New Mexico and Oklahoma and other parts of the central United States that was driving these kinds of leases. And even up until 2005, there were a lot of lawsuits that were talking about financial mismanagement between the federal government and the Indian allottee. You saw some of these dynamics, some of the worst criminal dynamics represented in the Killers of the Flower Moon movie and book that you might have seen a couple of years ago that was about oil and oil development around this time, around this allotment era. Although, the case of the Osage is a little bit different, so I don't want to conflate that story too much with this particular history that I'm talking about here. Now, going into the 1930s, this is really when you have the basis, the foundation for modern tribal governance with the Indian Reorganization Act. Following a similar kind of major shift in the United States with the Great Depression and the federal response to that in the New Deal, in the election of Franklin Roosevelt, and majority Democratic Congress in the 1930s. I think it was the 1932 election, where they really, Roosevelt appointed a whole new a whole new cabinet, including a new Secretary of Interior, and a new Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and John Collier, who were rethinking the federal government's relationship with tribal nations. There were no tribal governments at this time. There were semblances of governments, including a 1923 council that was created arbitrarily in northern part of the Navajo Nation, but there was no real basis in law for these councils or these kind of ad hoc councils to exist. And so in 1934, Collier, with a number of other people, Wheeler, Howard, all these senators came together, drafted this legislation, the Indian Reorganization Act, and this creates the basis for modern tribal governments. It creates councils, usually a council system, for the tribes who accept these Indian Reorganization Act governments. Famously, the Navajo Nation rejected it, yet we were still organized under it. And it's it's interesting how that all played out. It's particular to Navajo political history, but basically the main effect that the Indian Reorganization Act had with tribes was to centralize decision making into a particular group, usually men at this time, a very patriarchal legislation. That would and these people would be given the authority to make leases, both for land leases and subterranean mineral leasing for on behalf of the whole nation. So that this was in lieu of lack of those kinds of authorities existing in treaties, especially treaties going back to like 1868 in the case of the Navajo Nation, which had a very cumbersome way for leases to be agreed upon between Navajo people and an outside entity. So this really centralized those authorities into a government. Now, we had in 75 and 1994, and then even into today, those authorities have only been expanded. The Indian Determination Educational Assistance Act, the government relations. So those are the political authorities. But what's often missing is that in conversations about this is what's going on in the left-hand column, development in Indian country, how these political changes affect development approaches for tribes. And so with the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act in 1938, Congress also passed a Mineral Leasing Act, which invested these authorities within leasing authorities within the tribal government. It also expanded those in 82 and 2017, and even further, the ability of tribal governments to make these decisions. So that's been the main drive since for almost 100 years now, is to have a central political authority in federally recognized tribes, and for that centrally that political authority to expand its powers to what it can decide on, or more to point, like, does it need to go through a whole review process with the Secretary of Interior or other parts of the federal government, or can these decisions be made without any further review, which can be time consuming and prevent people from wanting to invest in tribes, and then and then expanding the scope of those decisions when it comes to mineral development, mineral leasing, over the course of the last 100 years, including now land leasing for renewable energy technologies and that sort of thing. So going back to the first slide, part of the reason why I think the Green Jobs Act didn't grow roots within the reservation, why it wasn't able to produce the results that it aspired to, is because um, it wasn't working through the tribal government in the same way that that coal leases were, in the way that oil leases were, or other kind of extractive leases were for up until that point, the previous 80 years. So that there's kind of a path dependency at work. There's a lack of knowledge outside of that particular way of making these decisions. In other words, the tribal government or people who worked within the tribal government knew how to sign these kind of leases through the council and the Navajo Nation, the executive branch of the government, but didn't know how to do the kinds of arrangements, the leasing arrangements that were being advocated in the Green Jobs Act. And so, if you have any more questions about that, I can answer it during Q&A. But it's just to say that they were not that wasn't as consistent with these kinds of broader overstructures that created this. So what has been the effect? Well, this is a map that I hired somebody to make a few years back, and it's in my book. But it highlights the infrastructure in around coal mining over the last 50 years, especially in the Black Mesa area. And so you have a rail infrastructure that's been built to move that coal to the former Navajo generating station, or from the Navajo mine to the Four Corners generating station, and that infrastructure is only for coal use. They're trying to figure out something to do with the rail that's been left over from the former Kayenta mine, and then of course, there was rail that connects to the larger BNF Santa Fe Railroad that goes from Chicago to Los Angeles, just that is at the very bottom of our reservation. Let me see. So another point I wanted to make during this presentation is to say that there's in energy transition conversations, there's this tendency to think that there's an inevitable, the fancy word is teleology, but the less fancy way of talking about it is to say that there's a direct path between extractive industries to the future of energy, which is always going to be, looking like the Jetsons, based on like new technology or technology that doesn't exist, and that there's this idea of the future out there that will be improving, making more efficient and cleaner the kinds of energy production that we're doing today. That's always been the way we've thought about things. And often our ideas of the future cloud the way we think about the present and decisions we're thinking about in the present. And that's for all sides on the political spectrum. But I think it's mainly for the green energy people where this idealization tends to really to run into the world of imagination. And it's this idea that technology that doesn't exist now will eventually fix the problems of today with energy production. And what was really interesting for me when I started this research back in 2013, 2014, I was thinking about this in terms of the climate conversations happening then. But as I was doing this archival work, I saw like, oh, some of these things were said in the past that were predicting what would be in the future, and they turned out to be very wrong. And so this was a quote that I uncovered from Norman Littell, who was a non-native tribal attorney in 1966 when he was advocating for the council to initially get involved in coal and to get involved in some of the leases that I ended up covering the end life of. You know, he was there at the beginning, I was at the end. And he says, long after all of us have left this mortal world, in very dramatic language, coal will still be going strong. But when it does run out, you have thermonuclear power, which can create and generate electric power far cheaper than hydropower. So his idea was that nuclear would eventually replace coal. That's not what happened. And that coal would run out as a physical limitation, not as a cost thing, and that would be the serious limitations around coal. It turned out coal lasted much longer than any of the people who signed the leases believed it would, and that there was a whole social embeddedness of it, meaning there was an identification with coal that happened as a result of decades of people participating in it. And so this whole scenario that he predicted was mainly wrong. Um, and but to get to the end point, when coal did close, when it did finally end, it had to do with the cost of the cost of the production, how the utilities were thinking about it. And it has been on a decline over the last 20 years. You can see this reflected in these trends, both in Native America and in the broader US. There's just a dramatic drop off in coal production. Um, this is a picture I took in the Kayenta chapter in 2013 when the community was thinking about what is the future for coal in the Navajo Nation on that aforementioned leased um, extension that I was talking about that we eventually passed. But even at that point, community members were expressing some of the long-term problems that coal had on the people, not only in terms of environmental damage, but also health risks. You know, with all that coal dust blowing around with the strip mining and blasting and all of that near to where they were living, and so in the end, you know, they were faced with this conundrum: should we continue with it because of jobs, or should we end it because of some of the challenges that it has for us? So this embeddedness, this kind of question that the community is trying to answer in 2013, was not anticipated in 1966. um, Here you see some of the abandoned infrastructure from one of the previous mines, a Black Mesa mine. This was a water slurry, which I don't talk too much about in this presentation, but I can talk more about it. People have heard of it and have questions in the Q&A. And this is a picture I took outside of the Chevron mine. It used to be called the Pittsburgh mine, outside of between Gallup and Window Rock. And it was just to emphasize that coal is a dangerous kind of work. It's a very hard kind of work. The In the course of my research, I was interviewing coal workers alongside tribal officials and others, and you know, a lot of the things that they shared with me was how hard it was just to maintain family life. You know, in coal work, like if you're working an overnight shift and your family has a normal kind of sleep schedule, even though you live in the same house, you're missing normal social interactions with them, and so that creates a kind of distance, you know, a social distance, even if you're physically close to each other. And also, you know, there's a lot of accidents. You can go through and find old lawsuits or old settlements between workers who were either injured or even killed on the job, and big mining companies like Peabody, or in this case Chevron, for when workers are injured on site. Um, Another part of the coal legacy is its effect on the landscape. This was a picture I took in 2013 again of one of the former mines, Black Mesa mine, which was out of production at that time, and how the landscape was trying to be remediated through through reclamation activities to try to recover it and make it like it was prior to coal mining, which is really hard to do, and there's still a lot of toxicity that's near the surface of the landscape. So the main point that I got out of that work, out of that research, is that coal workers were identifying with this industry, and that's part of the reason why they were pushing for it. It wasn't just about money, but about identity and work. And so this particular co-worker named, who I gave a pseudonym David, says that linked it to this idea of ego, which is a Diné concept about doing things yourself and taking care of yourself. And so he links his work to that. And what I said in the book and other publications is that this idea of ego is linked to a subsistence kind of economy. It was learned through decades of living off the landscape, both in terms of traditional types of activities like growing your local foods or herding sheep, because you have to have that grit in order to live off the land. But then that was translated into a wage labor type of economy, which is different, right? You're indirectly getting the things you need through wage labor. You get the wages, and then you have to purchase the things you need. You're not growing things yourself. You're not hunting the animals yourself anymore. You're buying the meat at the store. It creates a whole different relationship with the environment when you're earning your money through wages as opposed to doing it yourself. Yet that idea, that ethic, which ego translated into the wage labor economy. And sociologically, I thought that was really interesting. So I was saying that there wasn't a huge shift between subsistence and wage labor work in cultural attitudes, and that might be what maybe late 19th century sociologists would predict. But some of the legacies have been, not only the loss of jobs because of the closure of the mine, but a loss of water and a loss of land. And so you saw that remediated land in the previous picture. It's land that can't be used in the same way as other kinds of lands that are not impacted by coal. So even though it's still part of the contiguous reservation, it's still not land you can use the same way. So it is a form of land loss that is underappreciated when we're thinking about some of the legacies of extraction. Now, to share quickly some of the work that we've been doing now, more of the contemporary research. So I've been working through a couple of grants on some of these same kind of perceptions that I found in coal, but how do those perceptions about and that kind of identity with an industry, with an extractive industry, exist among tribes that are primarily getting their revenues through oil and gas? In other words, what does an oil and gas industry look like? What are some of the social dynamics of an oil and gas industry compared to coal, which I just showed some of? And so some of these quotes come from the Southern Ute. This is a picture taken on the Southern Ute Reservation, some of the oil production there. And you can see this is a map just to show where it is. If it's in the right-hand corner in Colorado, relative to the Navajo Nation. And some of the quotes are saying things like, sorry for the long quotes, I could say that since fossil fuels were developed on the reservation, they've taken that resource and have, I do believe, utilized tribal knowledge in their decision-making process. They've taken what technologies are available to develop the resources, but they've also taken the responsibility from cultural knowledge to find a way to be respectful of their neighbors and of gaining the technology expertise, to find balance to develop that resource, and they will continue to update their knowledge to try and maintain some kind of balance that does not create negative impact from their point of view. So this was a member of the Ute tribe, the Southern Ute tribe, reflecting on oil development for the tribe, which is a huge part of that tribe's regular benefits. It's not only benefits the tribal government, but in the case of the Southern Ute, it's also benefiting the members directly. And what he is saying in this case is that the Southern Ute way of doing oil is more culturally informed than maybe another oil company that is not native that comes in and might extract. That they are taking better care of the land than some of these other companies. So that's the perspective coming from a Ute member when they're thinking about the impact of these kind of industries on their landscape. On another perspective, this is another informant. I do support renewable energy, but it must be placed in a manner that is beneficial and in the term not just money, but to the religious understanding and leadership of the indigenous group. In other words, it has to still maintain that kind of cultural knowledge that the previous speaker had talked about. That is something, it has to go through the unique understanding of resources and responsibility to the land that the Southern Ute might have compared to a non-native group that would be even developing renewable energy technologies. And this particular interviewee also highlighted some of the more recent critiques of these quote unquote green energy technologies that were not as prevalent of critiques back in 2009 from the first picture of the presentation. So, and this is coming from 2023, that when this interview was done. So this person says, even the new technology, lithium, the hunger for lithium, look at Nevada, and he's referring to some of the pressures to develop lithium near Paiute land, and some of the biggest open mine pits that are going to be put in place are because of hunger, trying to find alternative fuels of energy. Okay, I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to wrap up real quick and show you some of the perspectives of oil on the Navajo Nation. And this is some ongoing research that I'm doing with a number of students, including Marley Lister, who's a Navajo scholar. Some of the report. So earlier this year, we oh, there's a hand raised. We interviewed Navajo people in near Shiprock, and they were saying, they were emphasizing that they would like to have more emphasis on preserving the way of life rather than just finding whatever kind of new energy technologies the federal government's interested in. So you can see this quote. It says, to me, it's like they're throwing things at the wall and seeing what will stick in terms of federal funding, that we're just always chasing the federal policy and we're not really focused on what we want to do. So by 2025, we're starting to say, hey, do we even want to be in energy development anyway? Or are there other kind of things we can be doing with this time? So anyway, I'll just end by saying fossil fuels so far have defined a particular brand, practice, and understanding of tribal sovereignty in the particular, and I use particular twice because I want you to know it's particular, in a particular energy epoch, meaning, are we in the era of green jobs? Are we in the era of drill, baby, drill? These particular changes, although they might oscillate quickly or they might be longer standing trends, they are defining epochs through which tribal sovereignty can be exercised. An alternative or renewable energy technology defined against fossil fuels, such as at green jobs going back to 2009, are reworking our understanding and practice of tribal sovereignty, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. Anyway, I'll stop sharing my work now, and you all can ask any questions. Okay, so there's a hand raised and there's a question in the forum. Would you prefer that I'll answer the question in the forum, and then maybe, I don't know if people are able to directly ask the question to me, or if it's got to be through the forum. I don't mind either way. But the question is, what is the future of green energy in Indian country? Well, it's I don't know. It's the end answer. But I will say some factors involved from the research that I've learned is that it depends on how green energy is defined. So, a whole nother topic that I didn't mention here was the creation of Navajo Transitional Energy Company in 2013. And one of the interesting things about that particular company, which has only become a coal company, it just invests itself in coal. And so, it's people are critical of it because it only focuses on coal development. But what was interesting for me was how they were defining new energy technologies. So environmental groups at the time were saying sustainable or renewable, and those tell you, like, they suggest a couple things, like renewable, like it's from the wind, it's from the sun. These are things that are in continual supply, or even hydro is like that. Um, Alternative means it's not conventional. And so that can include things like nuclear or coal gasification, which was what the tribe was pushing at the time. And that's not what the environmental groups were thinking about when they were talking about alternative. So really the definitions become important, especially when you're defining what is fundable, or for certain kinds of maybe tax breaks, or support from the federal government within law. The definitions are important. And so that's so what we mean by green becomes important when we're talking about the future of these industries. Could you speak a little more to what you might see between the Navajo Nation and Southern Ute's respective approaches to oil and gas development? Is Southern Ute's approach a potential model? It has been seen as a potential model for many, many years. But and I think it's influenced, if we go back to like 40 years in tribal history. So the Southern Ute have developed their own company, Red Willow, to create and develop these resources, and they've created a fund, an investment fund from profits derived from oil and gas, and have been very strategic in how they invest that, and very successful in how they invest those monies. And I believe that's what influenced um, some of the thinking among tribal leadership in the mid 80s, when they were putting together our permanent trust fund in 1985, which is our first fund. So also the Navajo Nation has created funds. So it's monies that we get. So money like non-federal revenue. Sorry, tribal budgets are very complicated, and they're interesting because we're never in the red. We're always in the black, right? We never go into deficit spending. Like the United States is how many $billion in deficit? Japan, every kind of developed nation is always in deficit. All the undeveloped nations, including Navajo Nation, is never in deficit. So it makes you think about that whole question of our deficits problems. But with the Navajo Nation, we get money from taxes, small kinds of taxes, not income tax, but fuel, excise tax, sales tax, and land taxes. So we own private land, and we'll lease it out to like cattle ranchers, and we'll get some money from that land leases and some taxes off that. And then so every year annually, these funds will siphon off the money, like 13% go into permanent trust fund, 11% go into veterans fund. So then all of these funds immediately get the money that the tribe generates that is not federal in origin. And then what's left over is what the tribal government spends, so which is usually very little. And then these funds are then given to East Coast investment managers, like the Blackstone Group, and then they invest it all over the world in currencies and industries and whatever. So then all of that becomes part of the financialization of the Western wealth, which is based on the perceived value of that money at any given time, and then every year we get revenues from that, just like you probably get with your retirement or others. And then we can decide whether or not to spend it. So yeah, we've been following that fund model for about 40 years now, and we always look to the Southern Ute. Now, some contextual differences between Navajo Nation and Southern Ute is population. We're the second largest in population. I think Cherokee's only larger than us. And Somebody's calling me. Anyway, so that's that. Is this? So I heard that it shut down. So I'm just going to end my participation right now, and then you can contact the organizers of this if you have any other questions. I'm sorry about that.